Well, my next guest says the debt crisis in Europe could lead to another credit crunch, but there could be a solution if the Fed and the ECB take action, if there's joint central bank action. He's the global head of interest rate strategy at Morgan Stanley, Jim Caron, joining us from his studio there, or his offices. Thanks so much, Jim, and long time no see. I know we've talked quite a bit before about the Fed rate policy in the past. Okay, before we get to what the Fed could do to help out the Europeans, you keep hearing that there is this growing credit squeeze in Europe. Is there a squeeze or not happening right now?
Well, I don't really see any evidence as there is a credit squeeze going on in Europe. Now, we have to do one thing in particular, is we have to separate liquidity from solvency. Initially, it was a liquidity problem. The ECB came in with $1 trillion package and they solved the liquidity problem. And then what the market started to focus on was the solvency issues. And I think to some degree the market starts to focus on some of the wrong things. For example, one of the metrics that the market uses is a debt to GDP measure, which for the Euro zone is averages somewhere around 80%, and for Greece, where people talk about debt to GDP at about 115%.
Right.
And being able to get that under control. But one of the things I think that they miss is effectively the servicing cost, the debt servicing cost as a percentage of GDP still remains relatively low in Europe. It's about 4%. And in terms of the tax revenues that go to pay for that debt servicing cost as a percentage of GDP is also relatively low at around 10–11%. So from a solvency perspective, it looks like the European governments can buy the time through these liquidity measures to address the solvency issues via fiscal austerity. So I don't think the market's giving Europe enough credit.
Is that low cost of funding, though, something that is going to be at least long-term or permanent for them? Well,
look, the cost of funding right now, the average coupon on the debt in the Eurozone is about 4%. That's a pretty low cost. Historically, it's at very, very low costs.
But isn't the problem, sorry, Jim, but isn't the problem, though, that even though Greece's cost of funding is low, that they're borrowing on too short-term of a basis?
Well, look, I mean, you're absolutely right. You can't borrow, you can't short fund yourself through these events. But what some of the ECB plans enable them to do is extend out their funding. And I think for the entire Eurozone, with about an average of 4% rate on their debt, they have some time. I think that people are rushing to a decision of default.
Okay.
When the reality is that if it does occur, it may take a lot more time.
Right, Jim. Okay, but in the time that we have, just really quickly, tell me though, I am hearing we're hearing reports that corporates in Europe, though, are finding it difficult to roll over their short-term debt. Is that not true?
Maybe on a case-by-case basis, there may have been some rumors to that effect, but in aggregate, overall, we're not seeing any systemic strains that's going through in terms of funding. Funding is the one thing that the ECB is getting very, very right in this whole event. They're making euros available. They're making collateral loans, collateralized loans, very, very available. The market's awash in liquidity, and that's something I think that overall people are missing.
Okay. All right, Jim. Really great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us again. That was Jim Caron, the global head of interest rate strategy at Morgan Stanley.